This woman got the fright of her lifetime when she received an unexpected inheritance from her grandma. It was a box filled with stuff, and the main attraction was this odd-looking doll. She was already confused when she grabbed it for the first time. But when the doll started to move, she immediately called the police. Woman inherits grandma's doll, immediately calls police when she feels it move. Jessie's grandmother passed away last month, and she was heartbroken. Jessie always had a close bond with the old woman, and it was hard to say goodbye. But little did Jessie know that this was far from the end of their story. Because this morning, a bizarre surprise awaited her when she woke up. Without her knowing it, things were already set in motion. And they were about to spring a huge surprise on the unexpecting Jessie. This surprise came in the form of a bizarre inheritance. A large box filled with seemingly random stuff was waiting for her when she walked down the stairs. Jessie was standing in her kitchen and was about to pour herself a much-needed cup of coffee when it happened. The doorbell rang, which was uncommon at this early hour on a Saturday. The confused woman opened the door and saw a large worn-down box on her porch. It read, "Inheritance." Jessie looked at the brown cardboard box with a small frown. "What is this?" The young woman took a step outside and scanned the environment around her house, but nobody was there. Who delivered this, she thought to herself. Carefully, she lifted the box and placed it on her kitchen counter. Some loose tape held the box's flaps together. And after Jessie pulled it loose, a strong, musky smell penetrated her nose. Inside, Jessie saw some random pictures of her grandmother and a few pieces of jewelry she had never seen before. But what caught her eye the most was an old large doll. The doll was the one thing Jessie recognized instantly. According to stories told by her grandmother, it was her favorite toy when she herself was younger. You might think that this fact invoked warm and cuddly feelings within Jessie. But the young woman remembered the doll for a different reason. The doll always had an aura of mystery around it for Jessie. Even when she was younger, her grandmother acted weird when Jessie came close to the toy. The old woman was weirdly protective of her doll, and whenever Jessie touched it, her grandmother got seriously angry and shunned her away. So, with this knowledge in her mind, Jessie found it highly bizarre that her grandmother left her this specific doll. The confused woman stared at the toy and was almost afraid to touch it, thinking that her grandmother could pop out at any moment to shout at her. But after some hesitation, she did it. Jessie held the doll in hand and wiped away some dust from the toy's face. The musky smell was most intense with the little girl's toy, indicating that it had been hidden in the attic for years. "It smells exactly like Grandma's house," Jessie said with a careful smile. Some fond memories arose. Jessie looked at the doll from every angle. What was so special about this thing that made her grandmother so protective? And why, after all these years, would she leave the doll in Jessie's care? Jessie didn't understand. But then, out of nowhere, the doll started moving beneath Jessie's fingers. The young woman was instantly frightened when she saw and felt the toy move on its own. The movement came from one of the doll's legs and looked highly unnatural. It was a wavy but non-rhythmic motion that sent shivers down Jessie's spine. "What the hell is that?" Jessie shouted. After that verbal outburst, Jessie dropped the doll on her kitchen floor. But by doing that, she only added tension to the situation because the image of the doll pushing itself forward on her with the tiled floor was beyond creepy. It was like the doll was possessed. What caused it to move like that? What is in that thing? Jessie was afraid to look because the whole thing felt extremely sketchy. The package with the doll appeared on her doorstep without warning and without a person delivering it in sight. So, the movement was the final straw in this bizarre roller coaster. Jessie needed to call for backup. With a confused and stressed out mind, Jessie reached for the phone. And when she did, there was only one number she could think of to call. The poor woman pressed 911, and after about a minute of waiting, a police officer answered. Jessie told the man about the box and the weird doll. Luckily for the frightened Jessie, the officer on the other end of the line took the case very seriously. He found the streak of weird circumstances highly suspicious. especially the part where no person was at her door to present the box to her. This feels deliberate, and I understand your worries. Because of all these weird events and the fact that Jessie wanted the doll gone as soon as possible, the officer invited her to come to the station. They would inspect the entire box together and see what could be discovered there. Jessie accepted this help gladly and hastily packed everything. The doll she tried to touch as little as possible. Once the creepy toy was back in the box, Jessie set out on her mission. Jessie put the car into gear and drove to the station in a hurry, almost hitting her stationary dumpster in the driveway. But that car drive was without worries. During the drive, Jessie looked at her back seat multiple times. It was where she placed the box, but the cardboard object was far from stationary. The doll's moving leg made sure of that. Jessie saw the entire box move erratically the whole trip, and this time, weird sounds even emanated from it. The sound started quietly, but after a few minutes, they easily surpassed the sound of her car's engine. What is inside that thing? Jessie got more nervous with every mile she drove. The anxious woman guessed it was an animal stuck in there. But what kind of animal makes such a bizarre sound? To keep her mind off the movement in the back seat, Jessie was nervous and tried to keep her mind busy. She thought about her youth and her grandmother's relationship with the doll. Why did she give this to me? What is the meaning behind it? Is she trying to tell me something? Even though this mind trick did not give Jessie any answers, it did make the stressful drive feel much shorter. Before she knew it, the young woman stood in front of the police station. Jessie stepped inside and placed the box on the front desk, asking for the police officer who called her. Jessie sounded panicked, which raised the alarm with multiple cops. They asked her to remain calm, and tension mounted as they stepped closer. But before they could reach Jessie, a familiar face was heard in the background. It was the officer from before asking his colleagues to stand down and inviting Jessie to come closer. Jessie was invited to step into the station's interrogation room. There, the research could finally start. But what they ended up finding was even more crazy than anything Jessie's mind could ever conjure on its own. The police officer introduced himself as Bill Baxter and wasted no time after that. There was only one way to find out what caused this movement: to cut into the doll itself. Jessie nodded but took a step back while she did. She was eager to know what it was that scared her so much. The frightened woman was still convinced it was an animal. What if it's dangerous? Jessie stood in the far corner and placed her hands before her eyes while Officer Baxter used sharp scissors to cut into the doll's fabric. What if it's a poisonous snake? Jessie asked, scared. The officer was too focused to respond, but shortly after, he let out a loud sigh. What? What is it? What do you see? Jessie was afraid to remove her hands, but after Officer Baxter placed his scissors on the table, he told her everything was fine. He asked Jessie to come closer so they could look at the doll's innards together. Jessie slowly lowered her. At first, Jessie didn't see much. The doll lay before the officer, and his large back covered most of the toy. But when Jessie was within striking distance, the officer showed the nervous woman something she did not expect. He held the doll by its arm and placed his fingers inside the hole he created. Jessie responded jumpy and asked the officer what he found. Officer Baxter pulled his fingers out of the doll's leg, and what Jessie saw then was definitely not an animal. The moving object was small and mechanical, and its weird rattling motions made the eerie sounds Jessie had heard before. Jessie was a bit relieved after realizing that there was no animal inside, but she remained just as confused. The little machine looked like it came right out of a Matrix movie with its bolts, springs, and bizarrely moving parts. But why was it in the doll her grandmother gave her? Officer Baxter stated that the mechanism itself wasn't all that weird. He guessed the mechanism was probably in the doll since it rolled off the factory floor. He had done a quick Google search and found out that the toy could walk. But there was a far more disturbing feature on this device. And this disturbing feature was definitely not supposed to be inside of the doll. Officer Baxter held the walking mechanism up to the light and showed Jessie a faint blinking red light in the middle. Do you see it? he asked her while pointing at the blinking. Jessie nodded. Jessie did not understand why the officer was so focused on this feature, but she understood completely after he explained what it was. Agent Baxter stated that there was a small device attached to the doll's walking system, and the red light was its battery indicator. It's a recording device. You told me this device just appeared on your front porch without any prior warning? The policeman asked Jessie while removing the recording device from the main walking system. Jessie's worries were right back where they started as she carefully nodded, yes. And that's when the policeman found something else. He fiddled with his fingers inside the doll while conversing with the worried Jessie. And when he stopped talking, he pulled out two other objects. One was a modern brass key, and the other was a folded-up note. He placed both of them on the table, after which Jessie unfolded the paper. When the paper lay flat on the interrogation table, Jessie instantly recognized who it was from. It was her grandmother's handwriting, and the written message was addressed to her. The letter stated the following: Dear Jessie, if you found this letter, that means that my doll has reached you safely. Inside this doll, you will find two other objects of great importance, a key and a recording device. Keep them both safe and don't show them to anyone within the family, not all of them can be trusted. Jessie stopped reading momentarily and looked at Officer Baxter with a confused look. He was just as curious as she was, so without hesitation, Jessie kept reading. The device on the doll's legs is a recording device, and I want you to hand it to the authorities. It holds crucial information that will ensure your future safety. Agent Baxter grabbed the device instantly and walked to his computer. While Officer Baxter tried to read out the information on the recording device, Jessie read the last piece of the letter. It stated that her grandma's brother was also after her inheritance since she received the bulk left behind money from their parents when they died. He threatened and even broke into my house. The officer eventually got the recording working, and together with Jessie, they listened to the audio tape. There was a lot of background noise, but after a quick search, they heard plenty of heavy discussions between Jessie's grandmother and her brother. The threats she spoke about in the letter were real and very incriminating. And not just that. He also threatened the life of the person who would get the money after she perished. Shortly after the discussions ended, another audio fragment was heard. It was the same brother that was walking around the house. He cursed a lot, saying that the money had to be around here somewhere. That is probably the break-in moment my grandmother was talking about, Jessie stated. The officer nodded as he looked at his computer with a disgusted look on his face. The corrupt brother was heard incredibly well. And on the tape, he, without knowing it, gave a full confession of his crimes. Jessie did not know her grandma's brother very well, but she couldn't believe that someone's flesh and blood could do such a horrible thing. He didn't love his sister at all. He was only out for her money, claiming that much of it was his. The tape ended with a spoken clip of Jessie's grandmother. Officer Baxter stated that the recording was made on January 12th, which was 8 days before Jessie's grandmother eventually died. The old lady hoped this was enough evidence to incriminate her brother. She would let her best friend drop off the box at Jessie's doorstep. And she hoped that Jessie would figure out the rest. And apparently, the old lady knew her grandchild very well because the frightened Jessie acted perfectly according to plan. She even went to the police station before finding the device. After the recording stopped, both Jessie and the officer knew what to do. The officer went out to arrest the brother. And Jessie's mission revolved around the key. Because the last part of her grandmother's letter stated that the key belonged to bank safe in town, she got in her car and drove to the large bank building while Officer Baxter drove the other way. When Jessie arrived at the bank, she presented the key to the clerk. The suited and clean-looking man seemed to know exactly what safe Jessie came for because he gestured for her to walk with him without any other explanation. After they reached the designated vault, it was up to Jessie to open it. She twisted the key and was in shock when she saw its contents. The vault turned out to be filled with over $100,000 worth of money. It was more than Jessie ever imagined, and now it all belonged to her. When Jessie eventually arrived home with the briefcase full of cash, she placed it on the kitchen counter, where the doll lay before. "Grandma, what a mysterious woman you were," Jessie said, smiling. A couple of minutes later, the phone rang. It was Police Officer Baxter. He found the old lady's brother and arrested him on the spot. The man was in custody and would no longer bother Jessie. And that promise turned out to be true. Because about a month later, the old man was trailed and found guilty of burglary and intimidation. He would spend a few years in jail and would receive a restraining order afterward. Jessie was happy to hear this. Her grandma's inheritance was safe with her. And all because of that mysterious doll.